Have you ever believed something simply because it sounded familiar? Not because you had proof, not because someone trustworthy confirmed it, but simply because you had heard it before. Maybe many times. Maybe from different people. Maybe in different places. And suddenly, without realizing it, it ceased to be a possibility and began to seem true. Have you ever experienced this? Think about it for a moment. How many ideas do you carry with you today that you've never really stopped to question? Ready-made phrases, quick explanations, opinions that seem too obvious. They didn't come from deep investigation, nor from careful analysis. They came from repetition. They came from familiarity. And the most intriguing thing is that, for the human brain, this is usually more than enough. From a very early age, our brains learn to use shortcuts. They need to. The amount of information we receive every day is absurd, and analyzing everything in depth is simply not feasible. So the brain creates quick strategies to decide what to trust and what to ignore. One of these strategies is simple, almost elegant. If something seems familiar, it must be safe. If it's safe, it's probably true. And so, without fanfare, one of the most powerful illusions of the human mind is born. Have you ever heard something so many times that it started to seem true, even without knowing exactly where it came from? Have you ever trusted information just because it sounded right? Because it matched what you already believed, because it didn't cause discomfort? This happens to all of us. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not naivete. It's brain function. The brain doesn't ask if something is true. It asks if it seems familiar. This phrase may sound strange at first glance, but it accurately describes a silent mechanism that influences decisions, beliefs, opinions, and even memories. Familiarity creates a sense of mental fluidity. Something is easy to process, requires no effort, and doesn't generate internal conflict. And, for the brain, ease is often confused with reliability. The less energy something requires, the more comfortable it seems. And comfort is often interpreted as truth. Now, pay attention to this. This process happens even when we are convinced that we are critical, rational, and attentive. It happens while you browse social media, while you watch videos, while you read headlines, while you listen to casual comments. Repetition wears down the sense of doubt. The brain lowers its guard. Information ceases to be analyzed and becomes merely recognized. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because this confusion between familiarity and truth isn't a curious detail of psychology. It shapes how we perceive reality. It influences what we believe about the world, about others, and about ourselves. And the most unsettling thing is that often we don't even realize when this is happening. Perhaps you're thinking, but I don't fall for that easily. And that's exactly the trap. The brain doesn't warn you when it's using this shortcut. It doesn't hold up a sign saying, "Warning, this only seems true." It simply delivers a feeling, an impression, a silent certainty that wasn't built on facts but on repetition. Stay with me until the end of this video, because understanding why the brain confuses familiarity with truth changes the way you see information, opinions, and even your own convictions. As we go along, you'll realize that many certainties that seem solid are actually just mental echoes, ideas that have become too comfortable to be questioned. Now that you've realized that this feeling of, "this seems real," may have much more to do with how the brain works than with reality itself, it's worth taking the next step and looking more closely at this strange, silent, and profoundly human mechanism that operates behind the scenes of your mind. And perhaps, while you're listening to all this, some memory has already surfaced. A specific situation. An opinion you always repeated without knowing exactly why. An idea that seemed too obvious to question. If this topic resonates with you, if something here has already touched you in some way, leave it in the comments. Seriously. Tell us what has caught your attention so far, or a moment when you realized you believed in something just because it was familiar. This space becomes much more powerful when we transform the video into a conversation. When you comment, it's not just a message thrown into the void. It's someone on the other side reading it, recognizing themselves, realizing they're not alone in this strange experience of trusting what sounds familiar. And it's precisely this exchange that keeps this type of content from continuing to exist, continuing to reach more people who also feel there's something strange about how the brain constructs certainties. And if, on some level, this has already sparked your curiosity, it's also worth leaving a like on the video. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this type of reflection matters. Each like helps the algorithm understand that this content deserves to be shown to more people who enjoy exploring the mysteries of the human brain, the mind, and the perception of reality. Now, if you feel that this type of topic resonates with you, that it makes you think differently after the video ends, consider subscribing to the channel. It's not about numbers. It's about building a community of curious, restless people who like to question what seems too obvious. When you subscribe, you say without words, I want to continue exploring this. With that in mind, now that you've realized how familiarity begins to shape what seems true in your head, the next question almost arises on its own. What exactly happens in the brain to make this shortcut so powerful? And why does it work even when we believe we are thinking rationally? If you stop to observe calmly, you'll realize that this mechanism appears all the time in everyday life. It doesn't only manifest itself in big decisions or complex issues. It's present in the small certainties we carry without realizing it. A news item that appears in your feed, for example. At first, it catches your attention. Then it appears again on another profile. Later, someone comments on the same subject in a casual conversation. In a short time, that information no longer sounds strange. It seems familiar. And, without you realizing it, your mind begins to treat it as something reliable, even if it has never been verified. This is especially noticeable when we talk about repeated fake news. Not because people are naive or incapable of thinking, but because repetition creates a sense of stability. The brain interprets familiarity as an absence of threat. And when something doesn't seem threatening, it relaxes. It doesn't activate the alert mode, it doesn't go into deep analysis. It just acknowledges it. It's as if it were silently saying, I've seen this before, so it must be okay. The same thing happens with popular phrases that everyone says. Ideas that have been circulating for so long that no one remembers where they came from. Statements about human behavior, success, happiness, money, relationships. They are repeated in movies, books, social media, bar conversations. Over time, they cease to seem like opinions and begin to sound like universal facts. Few people stop to question whether it really makes sense or if it was simply absorbed over the years. Not because they don't know how to think, but because the brain prefers the shortest path. There are also those ideas that seem too obvious to be discussed. Concepts that have never truly been examined, but which carry enormous weight in our decisions. They influence choices, shape mindsets, and create invisible boundaries. And the more familiar they become, the less we perceive the impact they exert. The brain likes consistency. It likes continuity. Questioning something that seems known generates internal friction. It demands energy. And whenever possible, the brain tries to avoid this cost. It's important to make something very clear here. When this happens, we're not talking about a lack of intelligence. We're talking about brain function. This shortcut exists because, throughout evolution, it has been extremely useful. Recognizing familiar patterns helped our ancestors survive, react quickly, and make decisions without needing to analyze every detail of the environment. The problem is that this same mechanism operates today in a world saturated with information, where repetition doesn't mean truth, and familiarity can be manufactured. If this has ever happened to you, stay calm. Your brain is functioning exactly as it was programmed. It's trying to conserve energy, maintain internal stability, and avoid unnecessary conflicts. The discomfort begins when we realize that this silent process influences important decisions. Opinions we defend, beliefs we hold, judgments we make about others and about ourselves. All of this may be shaped by what seems familiar, and not necessarily by what is true. And here's a delicate point. The more an idea is repeated, the harder it becomes to see it from the outside. It blends with identity, with the feeling of, it's always been this way. Questioning something like that isn't just a rational exercise, it's an emotional challenge. The brain interprets doubt as instability. And instability, for it, is something to be avoided. That's why so many people defend fragile certainties with such conviction. Not because they have absolute certainty, but because that idea has become too comfortable to abandon. This mechanism also affects how we perceive transformation and change. New ideas, even when they are more truthful or more useful, require cognitive effort. They are unfamiliar. They cause strangeness. And the brain, faced with this, tends to resist. It prefers the known, even if it is limited. It prefers the repeated narrative, even if it hides a hidden truth. It is in the background of the mind that these decisions happen, long before any logical argument comes into play. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this process is not just a scientific curiosity. It's key to understanding how beliefs are formed, how narratives are consolidated, and why some ideas have such a large impact on how we perceive reality. There's a specific mechanism behind this confusion between familiarity and truth, a mechanism that operates almost invisibly, but produces real effects on our personal journey, our mindset, and the way we make decisions every day. When we begin to look at this more closely, we realize that many certainties did not arise from conscious analysis, but from a silent accumulation of repetitions. And the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that this is not an isolated detail, but a central piece in how the brain constructs meaning, coherence, and security in a chaotic world. That's where the revelations begin to emerge, not as ready-made answers, but as questions that change the way we see what always seemed too obvious. Before we move on with this reflection, it's worth leaving a comment here. If anything said so far resonated with you, please comment below. That makes sense to me. There's a curious moment when something ceases to be merely known and begins to be treated as true. It's not a conscious snap, not a clear rational decision. It's a silent shift. The idea doesn't change in content, but its status within the mind changes. It moves from the category of information to the category of certainty. And most of the time this happens without us even realizing it. This is the phenomenon we are trying to name here. Not with technical terms, not with complicated definitions, but with something much closer to real experience. The human brain wasn't made to check everything all the time. It was made to survive, adapt, maintain stability. To do this, it creates mental shortcuts. Quick paths that allow it to make decisions without expending too much energy. These shortcuts are not defects. They are evolutionary solutions. The problem begins when they operate out of context. One of these shortcuts is simple and powerful. What is familiar seems safe. What seems safe requires no effort. What requires no effort tends to be accepted. This is how familiarity becomes a sign of truth. Not because something has been proven, analyzed, or tested, but because the brain recognizes that pattern and relaxes. It understands that it has dealt with this before. And if it has dealt with it before, it doesn't need to investigate again. Think about how you react to something completely new. Your body tenses up a little, your mind becomes more alert. There's a slight internal friction. Now compare that to the feeling of hearing something familiar, something you've heard many times throughout your life. The reaction is different. There's fluidity. There's comfort. The brain loves comfort because comfort means saving energy. And saving energy has always been a priority for the brain. The equation is silent but constant. Familiarity breeds security, security reduces effort. When effort decreases, in-depth analysis decreases as well. Not because you chose not to think, but because the brain understands that it's unnecessary. It goes into automatic mode. This mode is efficient, fast, and often functional. But it wasn't designed to deal with a world where false information can be repeated thousands of times in just a few minutes. This is where the mystery begins to take shape. An idea doesn't need to be true to become dominant. It only needs to be familiar. The more often it appears, the easier it becomes to process. And the easier it is to process, the more correct it seems. This doesn't happen at the conscious level where you think, this is true. It happens at the level of feeling. Seems right. Sounds right. It matches what's already there inside. This mechanism influences much more than just specific opinions. It shapes mindset. It interferes with important decisions. It creates internal narratives that guide choices without us even realizing it. Many personal transformations stumble on this point. It's not a lack of willingness to change, it's the weight of what is already familiar. The brain prefers continuity, even when it carries limitations. Questioning the familiar requires energy, generates instability, and challenges identity. There is also a deep emotional aspect to all of this. What is familiar is usually linked to memories, experiences, personal stories. It's not just a loose idea. It comes with feeling, belonging, internal coherence. Breaking with that is not simple. The brain interprets the break in familiarity almost as a threat. That's why so many hidden truths remain concealed behind comfortable certainties. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this mental shortcut doesn't just affect what we believe, but how we perceive the world around us. It influences judgments, reinforces biases, and constructs a sense of reality that seems solid but is often fragile. Behind the scenes of the mind, the brain is constantly negotiating between effort and comfort, between doubt and security. And almost always, without conscious oversight, it chooses the easiest path. But this shortcut comes at a price. The price is the confusion between what is known and what is true. It is the acceptance of ideas not because they make sense, but because they don't cause discomfort. It is resistance to change even when it would be beneficial. It is the silent impact on how we interpret information, people, and situations. When this mechanism goes unnoticed, it governs important decisions without asking permission. The most intriguing thing is that the more intelligent and informed someone considers themselves, the greater their confidence in this automatic mode can be. The feeling of "I already know this" closes doors. The brain understands that there is nothing new there. And without novelty there is no curiosity. Without curiosity there is no investigation. Thus, repeated ideas become rigid mental structures. difficult to question, even when reality points in another direction. This is an uncomfortable but necessary journey. Looking at this phenomenon isn't about distrusting everything, but about recognizing when the brain is confusing familiarity with truth. It's about gaining awareness of the inner workings of one's own beliefs. It's about understanding that not all certainty stems from careful analysis. Many are born simply from repetition. And when that realization begins to emerge, something changes. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. A pause arises between information and acceptance. A space where the mind can breathe before deciding. It is in this space that new questions begin to appear, not as ready-made answers, but as an opening to see beyond what always seemed too obvious. If this reflection has sparked something within you, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." There's an idea that often bothers you when you first hear it, but makes perfect sense when you start to observe it more honestly. The brain is lazy. And, at the same time, incredibly efficient. These two things don't contradict each other. On the contrary, the brain's laziness is precisely what has made it so good at surviving, making quick decisions, and dealing with a complex world without collapsing. The brain hates unnecessary effort. It was designed to conserve energy whenever possible. Every deep analysis, every long reflection, every careful comparison consumes resources. Real thinking is tiring. And the brain knows this better than anyone. That's why, whenever it finds a way to reduce this expenditure, it uses it. Not out of malice, not out of carelessness, but strategically. Deep analysis requires sustained attention, active memory, comparison of information, and evaluation of consequences. It is a slow, costly, and often uncomfortable process. Recognizing something known, on the other hand, is the opposite of all that. It's quick, fluid, almost automatic. It doesn't require internal debate. It doesn't generate tension. It doesn't demand a revision of beliefs. It's comfortable. And comfort, for the brain, is a sign that everything is under control. This difference is crucial to understanding why recognition wins over analysis in most situations. When something seems familiar, the brain doesn't feel the need to activate critical mode. It understands that it has already been processed before, even superficially, and even if it has never been questioned. The simple act of recognizing it already functions as a provisional seal of approval. This is where a phrase that summarizes this mechanism with almost brutal precision comes in. Critical thinking is expensive. Recognition is cheap. Thinking requires continuous effort. Recognition requires only a flash of memory. A quick connection. I've seen this before. And, for the brain, this connection is usually enough to move forward. This process directly influences how we deal with information, opinions, and even ourselves. Many decisions are not made after in-depth analysis, but after a feeling of familiarity. Something sounds right. It seems aligned with what we already know. It doesn't generate internal resistance. So it's accepted. This process happens behind the scenes, without conscious narration, without warning. The most curious thing is that the brain doesn't make a clear distinction between recognizing something true and recognizing something repeated. For it, both activate similar circuits of fluidity and security. The easier something is to process, the more reliable it seems. And repetition is one of the most effective ways to make something easy to process. That's why repeated ideas gain strength even when they are weak. They become mental, not through merit, but through habit. This mechanism has a profound impact on mindset. It shapes what seems reasonable, acceptable, normal. New ideas, even when transformative, often generate initial resistance. They require effort. They require revision. They require breaking out of autopilot. Old ideas, even when they no longer make as much sense, continue to be defended because they are familiar. The brain prefers to maintain what it knows rather than explore what might be better. There is also a silent emotional factor in all of this. Recognizing something familiar brings a sense of control. In a world full of uncertainties, the brain seeks stability. The familiar offers this. It reduces anxiety, lessens the feeling of risk. Questioning what is familiar, on the other hand, can generate discomfort, doubt, insecurity. And the brain tends to avoid unstable internal states whenever possible. That's why so many hidden truths remain concealed behind repeated beliefs. Not because no one is able to see them, but because the emotional and cognitive cost of questioning is greater than the cost of continuing to believe. This choice is not conscious. It happens before reason comes into play. It's an energetic decision, not a logical one. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this brain behavior affects not only what we believe externally, but also how we see ourselves. Internal narratives about who we are, what we are capable of, what has always been this way, follow exactly the same pattern. The more an idea about ourselves is repeated, the more familiar it becomes. And the more familiar, the truer it seems. Even when it limits us, even when it hurts. This is one of the most delicate aspects of personal transformation. Change requires rethinking. It requires questioning the automatic. It requires expending energy where before everything flowed effortlessly. The brain resists because it has been trained to avoid this cost. It prefers recognition to analysis. It prefers to maintain the known rather than explore the unknown. Not for lack of potential but for efficiency. When we understand this, we begin to look at our decisions with more curiosity and less judgment. It's not about blaming the brain but about understanding how it works. It's not trying to sabotage us. It's trying to conserve our energy. The problem is that, in a modern environment, this energy conservation can distance us from deeper insights, more conscious choices, and truths that require more than mere recognition to be seen. There comes a point when this automatic mode starts to exact too high a price. When important decisions are made based solely on what seems familiar. When old beliefs continue to guide current choices without being re-evaluated. When the feeling of, "it's always been this way," prevents any different movement. It is at this point that comfort begins to be confused with stagnation. And the more we observe this process, the more we realize that it's not the exception, it's the rule. The brain works this way all the time. The question isn't whether it happens but when and with what impact. Recognizing this pattern doesn't solve everything but it creates a crack. A small space between the stimulus and the response. A moment when analysis can finally come into play. This space is subtle yet powerful. It allows familiarity to be seen for what it is. A sign of recognition, not proof of truth. From there, something begins to change in how the mind reacts. Not abruptly, not as a complete rupture, but as an opening. A renewed curiosity. A willingness to look again at what always seemed too obvious. And when that opening arises, new questions naturally begin to form. Questions that don't seek quick answers but a deeper understanding. That's when the journey truly gains another layer because the brain, even when lazy, is also capable of something extraordinary when invited to break free from autopilot. If this part of the reflection resonates with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. There's a point where all of this starts to get even more intriguing. Because we're not just talking about mental shortcuts or cognitive laziness. We're talking about a specific, silent, and deeply studied phenomenon that explains why repetition has so much power over what we believe. It's what many researchers call the illusion of truth. A simple name for something that has a huge impact on how we construct beliefs. The logic behind this isn't complicated. In fact, it's disconcertingly simple. The more a piece of information is repeated, the easier it becomes to process. And the easier it is to process, the more familiar it seems. This familiarity generates a feeling of mental comfort, an internal fluidity that the brain interprets as a sign of reliability. Not because it analyzed the facts but because everything flowed without resistance. The brain doesn't measure facts. It measures flow. This sentence sums up almost everything. The brain doesn't evaluate truth like an impartial judge assessing evidence. It evaluates sensation. It evaluates effort. It evaluates whether that information fits well with what is already stored. If the fit is smooth, the mind relaxes. And when the mind relaxes, doubt disappears. What's most disturbing is that this effect happens even when we know rationally that something is false. Even when, on some level, we are aware that the information is unreliable. Repetition still leaves its mark. It doesn't need to completely convince. It just needs to weaken resistance. It just needs to make the idea less strange, less uncomfortable, less questionable. Over time, a repeated lie doesn't exactly become the truth, but something worse. It becomes plausible. Something that could be. Something that doesn't sound so absurd. And this change in status is enough to influence decisions, opinions, and judgments. The brain begins to treat that idea with less caution. It lowers its vigilance. And that changes everything. This phenomenon helps explain why certain narratives survive for so long, even though they are fragile. They are repeated in different contexts by different people in different formats. Each repetition does not add new arguments but it adds familiarity. And familiarity acts like an invisible glue, fixing that idea in the mental repertoire. Behind the scenes of the mind, what is happening is not a logical evaluation, but a sensory adaptation. Information becomes part of the internal environment. It loses its label of new, and begins to be treated as known. And everything that is known requires less energy to be accepted. This energy saving is seductive to the brain. This mechanism has a profound impact on collective and individual mindsets. It shapes public opinion, cultural beliefs, and even personal convictions. Many ideas that seem obvious today didn't arrive there because they were true, but because they were repeated. They were reinforced over time until they became part of the background of perceived reality. There is also a cumulative effect in all of this. Each repetition doesn't act alone. It adds to the previous ones. Fluency increases little by little. Resistance gradually decreases. At some point, the mind no longer remembers when it began to accept that idea. It simply seems to always have been there. And that which has always been there is rarely questioned. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the illusion of truth doesn't only operate in what we consume externally, but also in our internal dialogue. Repeated thoughts about who we are, about the world, about our limitations and possibilities follow exactly the same principle. The more a thought returns, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar, the more true it seems. Even when it isn't. This dynamic explains why some personal beliefs are so difficult to change. They are not supported by evidence, but by repetition. They have been reinforced over years, sometimes a lifetime. Questioning them requires more than new information. It requires breaking the flow. It requires creating cognitive friction. And that costs emotional and mental energy. Faced with this cost, the brain often prefers to maintain the illusion. Not out of weakness, but out of efficiency. It chooses stability over the hidden truth. It chooses the known over the possibility of transformation. This pattern is not an isolated error, it is a structural trait of how the mind works. When we begin to see this, something shifts. Perception changes. We start to distrust people less and processes more. We understand that believing is not always a conscious choice, but the result of prolonged exposure. This changes how we interpret the impact of information on our daily lives. It also changes the way we deal with our own decisions. Many choices that seem rational are, in fact, guided by what already feels comfortable. Repetition creates a mental trail, and the brain loves trails. They allow for quick movement without the need for complex navigation. But always following the same trail limits the journey. There comes a point where understanding this mechanism ceases to be merely curious and becomes liberating. Because, by understanding that the sensation of truth can be manufactured, the possibility of pause arises. A brief automatic suspension. A moment when the mind can ask, is this really true or just familiar? This question doesn't arise aggressively. It appears as curiosity, as an opening, as an invitation to look again. And it is in this space that something begins to transform. Not immediately, not as a radical rupture, but as a fine-tuning in the way we perceive reality. The illusion of truth doesn't disappear when it's understood. It continues to exist. The brain continues to measure fluidity. But consciousness creates an extra layer. An inner observer that begins to notice when familiarity is being mistaken for validity. This is a silent but powerful step toward more conscious decisions. And the more this perception deepens, the more questions naturally arise. Questions about how this effect connects with emotions, with memory, with identity. Questions that point to even deeper layers of this strange phenomenon that governs so many beliefs without asking permission. If this passage resonated with you, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." When we start putting all these pieces together, something even more subtle emerges. Emotion. Because familiarity doesn't act alone. It almost never comes unaccompanied. What makes information truly powerful isn't just the fact that it's repeated, but the type of emotion that comes attached to it. And that's when the brain finally lets its guard down. Familiar information reduces alertness. This happens automatically. When something seems familiar, the brain interprets it as safe territory. There is no surprise, no apparent threat, no need for vigilance. It's like returning to a place you've been many times before. You don't look at every detail, you don't analyze every movement. You simply walk. You trust. You follow. In this state, questioning decreases. Not because you've decided not to question, but because the brain understands that it's unnecessary. The feeling of "I already know this" acts as an internal green light. And the less questioning, the more acceptance. The information enters, settles in, and becomes part of the mental landscape without resistance. Memory plays a central role in all of this. The brain doesn't just store facts, it stores emotional contexts. Every time an idea is presented alongside an emotion, fear, relief, hope, indignation, belonging, it gains more strength. Not as an argument, but as an experience. And experiences are much harder to dismantle than data. When something is familiar and emotionally charged, the effect is multiplied. Emotion acts as a chemical reinforcement. It marks the information. It gives it color, weight, and relevance. The brain learns quickly what comes with emotion because emotion has always meant something important for survival. What was moving needed to be remembered. What needed to be remembered needed to be quickly accepted in the future. That's why stories are so powerful. It doesn't matter if they're true or not. If a story evokes emotion and is repeated often enough, it sticks. It creates a sense of internal reality. The mind doesn't ask, did this really happen? It asks, does this seem familiar? And if the answer is yes, the brain relaxes and stops checking. This sentence sums up an entire process. When something seems familiar, the brain relaxes and stops checking. It shuts down the fine sensors, reduces skepticism, lowers the critical filter. Information enters like someone entering the house without knocking. There is no identity verification. There is no analysis of intent. Only recognition. This mechanism has a huge impact on how we interpret the world. News that evokes emotion and is repeated quickly gains the status of truth. Ideas that stir fear or hope spread easily. Simple, emotionally charged narratives become stronger than complex, cold explanations. The brain prefers what it feels, not what it proves. This also applies to how we see ourselves. Emotionally charged, repeated thoughts shape identity. I've always been like this. This isn't for me. Things never change. When these phrases are repeated internally over the years, they cease to be mere thoughts and begin to seem like faithful descriptions of reality. Emotional familiarity creates a sense of truth that is difficult to break. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this point marks an important turning point. We're no longer just talking about external information, but about how the mind constructs a coherent internal narrative, even if that coherence hides a hidden truth. The brain seeks emotional consistency. It wants things to make sense within the story that has already been created. Questioning something emotionally familiar is more difficult than questioning something neutral. It's not just an idea that's being challenged, but a feeling, a memory, a part of one's identity. That's why the resistance is so strong. The brain interprets this questioning as a threat to internal stability. And stability, for it, is the highest priority. Behind the scenes of this process, what happens is almost imperceptible. Emotion acts as a buffer against critical thinking. It softens the impact of doubt. It makes acceptance quicker. The stronger the emotion, the less room there is for analysis. Not because analysis disappears, but because it is considered unnecessary in that context. This pattern helps explain why so many beliefs persist even in the face of contrary evidence. It's not pure stubbornness. It's emotional attachment combined with familiarity. The idea is already integrated into effective memory. Removing it would require not only new arguments, but an internal reorganization. A small transformation in the way the person sees themselves and the world. This process also shapes important decisions. Many choices are made based on what sounds right, what seems aligned, what doesn't generate emotional discomfort. Rationalization comes later as a justification. First comes the feeling. Then comes the explanation. The brain decides at an emotional level and only then constructs a logical narrative to support the decision. When we understand this, we begin to perceive the silent impact of this mechanism on our personal journey. It's not about eliminating emotion. That would be impossible and undesirable. It's about recognizing when emotion is being used as a shortcut to automatic acceptance. It's about noticing when comfort is replacing investigation. There comes a point when this awareness begins to create a small distance between emotion and belief. A space where the mind can observe instead of reacting. This space is neither cold nor overly rational. It is curious. It asks without attacking. It observes without denying. And it is in this space that new revelations begin to emerge. As this awareness grows, something interesting happens. The brain continues to react to familiarity, but the mind begins to notice this reaction. An extra layer of consciousness emerges. An observer who notices when the alert dropped too quickly. When acceptance was automatic. When emotion took over without checking. This layer doesn't change everything at once, but it changes enough to open up possibilities. Possibilities for more conscious choices. Possibilities for questioning old narratives. Possibilities for real transformation, not based on willpower but on deep understanding. And when this understanding deepens, a new curiosity arises almost naturally. Curiosity about how all this manifests itself in daily life, in relationships, on social media, in collective decisions. Curiosity about the extent to which our certainties are truly our own, and to what extent they are merely emotional echoes of something that has become all too familiar. If all of this resonated with you on any level, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. When we start bringing all of this into everyday life, it becomes almost impossible not to see this mechanism working all the time, in very specific and familiar places. It doesn't live hidden in grand abstract theories. It appears on the screens we look at every day, in the phrases we read quickly, in opinions that seem too obvious to be questioned. That's where this confusion between familiarity and truth deceives us most effectively. Social media is perhaps the most evident stage for this process. Not because they are villains, but because they were built precisely to repeat, reinforce, and amplify patterns. The same idea appears in different formats, with slightly altered words, distinct images, different voices. The brain doesn't register each one as something new. It registers it as confirmation. The internal sensation isn't, "I'm seeing this again," but, "This is everywhere." And when something seems to be everywhere, the brain tends to treat it as shared reality. Headlines work in a similar way. They are short, direct, and emotionally charged. Often they don't explain, they only suggest. And when the same narrative appears repeatedly, even without in-depth analysis, it sticks. Not because it has been analyzed, but because it has become familiar. The mind recognizes the theme, relaxes, and accepts it. Few people stop to read beyond the title. And the brain once again appreciates the energy saved. This pattern extends to political opinions, perhaps even more intensely. Complex ideas are reduced to simple phrases, slogans, and easily recognizable labels. The more a position is repeated within a group, the truer it seems to those within it. The consistency of the arguments doesn't matter as much as the comfort of belonging. Familiarity here is not just cognitive, it's social. Questioning something familiar in this context requires not only mental effort but also emotional courage. And this doesn't just happen to other people. That's a crucial point. There's a natural tendency to observe this phenomenon from the outside, as if it were a collective failing, someone else's problem. But the truth is much more uncomfortable and, at the same time, liberating. It's not about others falling into this trap, it's about all of us. Without exception. Personal beliefs follow exactly the same path. Many ideas we hold about success, failure, love, money, ability, and limitations have never been deeply investigated. They were absorbed gradually, repeated at different times in life, and associated with strong emotions. Over time they became part of our internal landscape. Questioning them seems strange, almost unnecessary. The brain says, "It's always been this way." And when something has always been this way, it seems true by definition. This mechanism directly affects self-awareness. Many people believe they know themselves deeply, but what they actually know are familiar narratives about themselves. Stories repeated over the years. Internalized labels. Ready-made explanations for behaviors and choices. The brain recognizes these narratives, feels comfortable with them, and stops checking. Familiarity becomes identity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this point touches on something essential. When we begin to understand where this mechanism operates daily, a shift in perspective emerges. It's no longer about identifying external errors, but about observing internal patterns. It's about realizing how our decisions are influenced by what sounds right, and not necessarily by what has been examined. Many important decisions are made in this autopilot state. Career choices, relationships, stances, emotional reactions. The mind resorts to what it already knows, to what has worked before, to what doesn't require deep reevaluation. And this makes sense from an energetic point of view. The brain wants to conserve resources. The problem is that the context changes but the responses remain the same. Behind the scenes of these decisions, there's always this silent question being answered. Does this seem familiar? If the answer is yes, the brain moves forward. It doesn't stop to assess impact, long-term consequences, or alternative possibilities. It trusts the known. And this trust, while efficient, can limit the transformation journey. It's curious to see how even ideas that no longer make much sense continue to be defended with conviction. Not because they are true but because they are too familiar to be abandoned. The brain clings to what it recognizes. The cost of giving up an old belief seems greater than the cost of maintaining it, even when it generates discomfort or inconsistency. This pattern also manifests itself in relationships. Quick judgments, immediate impressions, expectations based on past experiences. The mind creates shortcuts to interpret people and situations. And the more these interpretations are repeated internally, the more true they seem. Little room is left for new readings, new possibilities, new revelations. When we begin to observe this more closely, something interesting happens. Guilt diminishes. Judgment falls. Understanding increases. It becomes clear that this is not a moral flaw, but a structural trait of mental functioning. The brain does what it has been trained to do. Recognize. Say. Simplify. But this understanding also brings responsibility. Because once we see the pattern, we can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. A silent choice arises: to continue operating on autopilot or to create small moments of pause. Small intervals between stimulus and response. Spaces where familiarity can be observed instead of obeyed. This space is where self-knowledge ceases to be mere introspection and becomes practice. It's not about doubting everything but about noticing when something is being accepted too quickly. When the mind has relaxed before checking. When emotion has paved the way for belief without investigation. This realization doesn't transform everything at once. It acts gradually, like a fine-tuning of the way we perceive reality. A subtle change in mindset. An internal shift that begins to influence future decisions. Not by force but by clarity. And the more this clarity grows, the more questions naturally arise. Questions about how this mechanism connects with fear, with belonging, with the need for security. Questions that delve even deeper into the inner workings of the human brain and how it constructs what we call truth. If this reflection resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. There comes a point when all of this ceases to be merely interesting and begins to feel unsettling. Because when familiarity takes the place of truth, the impact is neither small nor fleeting. It is silent, cumulative, and profoundly transformative. That is where the real danger of this mechanism lies. Not a dramatic or immediate danger, but a constant danger that shapes reality without asking permission. When the brain confuses comfort with truth, decisions begin to be made based on what seems safe, not on what is most coherent or aligned with reality. Important choices go through the filter of, "Does this sound familiar?" before any deeper analysis. And often this leads to wrong decisions not because there was a lack of information, but because the brain didn't even bother to look for it. Wrong decisions rarely seem wrong at the moment they are made. They often seem natural, obvious, almost inevitable. The brain looks at its known repertoire, chooses the option that generates the least internal friction, and moves forward. Only later, with time, does the impact begin to appear. And then comes the feeling of, how did I not see this before? The answer is usually uncomfortable. You saw it, but comfort prevailed. This same mechanism sustains limiting beliefs for years, sometimes for a lifetime. Ideas about inadequacy, worthiness, destiny, possibilities. Many of these beliefs did not arise from isolated experiences, but from constant repetition. They were said, heard, emotionally reinforced until they became part of one's identity. The brain recognizes these ideas as known and, therefore, true. Questioning them seems strange, almost a betrayal of one's own history. The danger here is not just believing in something false, but failing to explore what could be true. Familiarity creates a kind of invisible ceiling. It defines how far the mind feels safe to go. Anything that goes beyond that limit generates discomfort, doubt, fear. And the brain, faithful to its mission to protect, pushes the person back to the known. Even if the known hurts, even if it limits. Hasty judgments also stem from this place. The mind loves labels because labels are quick and save energy. When someone fits into a familiar pattern, the brain relaxes and stops observing. It thinks it already knows who that person is, what they will do, how they think. And, from that, it builds automatic reactions. Little room is left for nuance, context, or change. This pattern affects relationships, opportunities, and how we see the world. Often we believe we are being rational when in reality we are merely reacting to what seems comfortable. The brain creates shortcuts to deal with complexity, but these shortcuts, when not noticed, end up impoverishing the experience. Reality is filtered until it fits within what is already known. What's most unsettling is realizing that this process isn't neutral. It actively shapes the reality you live in. Not objective reality but perceived reality. What you believe to be possible. What you think is true. What you consider normal, acceptable, or inevitable. All of this passes through the silent filter of familiarity. The brain confuses comfort with truth, and that shapes the reality you live in. This statement is not an exaggeration. It describes a daily, almost invisible process that influences everything from small choices to major life directions. Comfort creates a sense of security that the brain interprets as reliability. And from this, it constructs coherent narratives, even if these narratives hide contradictions, omissions, or uncomfortable truths. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this silent danger isn't limited to error. It manifests itself primarily in stagnation. When the brain clings too much to the familiar, it begins to reject anything that requires internal revision. New ideas are discarded before they are even considered. Not because they are bad but because they are uncomfortable. This pattern creates a strange feeling of stability accompanied by dissatisfaction. Everything seems coherent, but something doesn't fit. The person feels they are repeating cycles, making similar decisions, arriving at similar results. And yet, the brain insists on the same paths because they are familiar. The cost of change seems greater than the cost of continuing. Behind the scenes of this dynamic, there is always a silent negotiation between curiosity and fear. Curiosity pulls us away from the known. Fear pulls us back towards comfort. And most of the time, fear wins. Not explicitly, but disguised as rationality, common sense, realism. The brain creates elegant justifications for not leaving its place. This is one of the reasons why so many transformations remain unfinished. The intention exists, the desire exists, but the mind continues to operate with the same filters. Familiarity defines what seems possible. And everything that escapes this field seems too risky. The brain doesn't see the hidden truth behind repetition. It only sees predictability. Understanding this mechanism is not comfortable. It dismantles the idea of absolute control over one's own beliefs. It shows that many certainties were not chosen but inherited, absorbed, repeated. This may generate resistance at first. But, little by little, it also generates freedom. Because, when the pattern becomes visible, it loses some of its power. This visibility doesn't eliminate comfort, nor does it transform everything at once. But it creates a crack in the automatic. A point where the mind can stop and observe. Where the question, is this true or just familiar, begins to arise spontaneously. This question doesn't accuse, doesn't confront. It simply opens up space. And it is in this space that something different begins to happen. The mind begins to tolerate a little more discomfort. Doubt ceases to be a threat and becomes a tool. The brain continues to seek comfort, but consciousness begins to negotiate. It begins to realize when comfort is costing too much. This process changes the relationship with decisions. They cease to be mere reactions to the known and become more conscious choices. Not perfect, not entirely rational, but less automatic. Perceived reality begins to expand. New possibilities enter the field of vision. Not because the brain has changed, but because you have begun to observe it. And the more this observation is explored, the clearer one thing becomes. The danger lies not in making mistakes occasionally. The danger lies in never questioning what has always seemed right. That's where familiarity becomes a prison. That's where comfort replaces truth. If this reflection resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Getting to this point changes something inside, even subtly. Not because there's now a magic solution or a foolproof method, but because the way we perceive how our own minds work is no longer the same. And that's the most important point to make clear. There is no total control over the brain. There's no switch to turn off mental shortcuts, emotions, or the search for comfort. Whoever promises that is selling a different illusion, perhaps even a more dangerous one. What truly exists is awareness. And awareness changes everything. Completely escaping this trap is unrealistic. The brain will continue to seek familiarity. It will continue to prefer what requires less effort. It will continue to react emotionally before analyzing. This is not a flaw to be corrected, it is a characteristic to be understood. The difference begins when you perceive the movement happening. When the automatic ceases to be invisible. This perception arises in small moments. When something seems too obvious. When an idea sounds too comfortable. When an explanation fits too quickly. These are the most interesting moments because that's exactly when the brain usually stops checking. And that's exactly when it's worth raising an inner eyebrow, not with aggressive distrust, but with honest curiosity. To question what seems obvious doesn't mean rejecting everything. It means pausing. It means realizing that the obvious is almost always constructed, not discovered. It arises from repetition, habit, and apparent consensus. Many important truths are not obvious at first. They cause strangeness. They require time. They demand reflection. The brain tends to reject them precisely for that reason. Questioning what feels comfortable isn't an attack on your own brain. It's an invitation to broaden your perception. Comfort isn't synonymous with truth. Sometimes it's just a sign of emotional familiarity. The brain likes what doesn't generate internal conflict, but growth almost always involves some level of discomfort. Not traumatic discomfort, but that slight friction that indicates something new is being considered. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this practice of perception doesn't only happen in the intellectual realm. It happens in real life, in everyday decisions, in conversations, in the silent choices that no one sees. It happens when you feel the urge to react quickly but choose to observe. When an opinion arises fully formed but you wonder where it came from. When an old belief presents itself as absolute truth, but something inside you asks for revision. The most powerful question in this process is simple, almost disconcerting in its simplicity. Is this true, or does it just seem familiar? This question doesn't need an immediate answer. It doesn't demand a conclusion. It simply opens up space. And opening up space is often the greatest act of transformation possible. When this question starts coming up more frequently, something interesting happens. The mind slows down a bit. The automatic impulse loses strength. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes more visible. And what is visible can be observed. The brain continues to offer shortcuts, but now there is someone looking at them. This someone isn't an idealized, overly rational or cold version of themselves. It's simply a more present awareness. An attention focused on the behind-the-scenes aspects of one's own decisions. This awareness doesn't change everything at once. It doesn't prevent mistakes. It doesn't guarantee perfect choices. But it changes the quality of the journey. Gradually, certain beliefs begin to lose their rigidity. Not because they have been refuted by external arguments, but because they have ceased to be automatic. They come to be seen as constructs, not as immutable facts. This does not generate insecurity, it generates freedom. Because what is constructed can be revised. It can be adjusted. It can be expanded. This process also changes our relationship with others. Judgments become less hasty. Others' opinions are seen with more context. The need to be right diminishes. Not because everything becomes relative, but because it becomes clear how much our certainties are influenced by repetition, emotion, and familiarity. This doesn't weaken the mind. On the contrary, it strengthens it. This has a profound impact on mindset. A person begins to realize when they are choosing the familiar path simply because it's familiar. You start to notice when you're avoiding something new just because it requires more energy. And, at times, you consciously choose to make the extra effort. Not always. Not all the time. But when it makes sense. This conscious choice is not noisy. It doesn't need to be announced. It happens silently, the instant the mind decides to investigate instead of accepting. It is at this instant that something changes behind the scenes. The brain continues to function as it always has, but consciousness begins to participate in the conversation. Over time, this creates a cumulative effect. Small pauses become habits. Small questions become a stance. Familiarity ceases to be automatically confused with truth. It becomes merely a fact, not a verdict. And this expands the way reality is perceived. None of this eliminates comfort. Nor should it. Comfort has its place. It protects, organizes, stabilizes. The problem begins when it becomes the only criterion. When everything that is uncomfortable is discarded before it is even understood. When the hidden truth is ignored because it doesn't sound good. This path of awareness isn't about living in distrust, but about living more awake. About noticing when the brain relaxed too quickly. When it stopped checking too early. When it decided based on what seemed right and not on what was investigated. And the more this awareness deepens, the more natural it becomes to ask this silent question amidst the flow of life. Not as an intellectual exercise but as an inner posture. Is this true, or does it just seem familiar? Sometimes the answer comes. Sometimes it doesn't. And that's okay. The value lies in the space that the question creates. This space is where new possibilities begin to emerge. Where decisions take on a different quality. Where mindset expands without having to fight against one's own brain. It is there that real transformation happens, not as a rupture but as growing awareness. If this part of the reflection made sense to you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something along the way resonated with you. Perhaps not as a ready-made answer, but as an honest provocation. And this kind of reflection is only worthwhile when we journey through it together, with time, curiosity, and a willingness to look a little beyond the automatic. If this content helped you see the brain, and perhaps even some beliefs, in a different way, it's worth subscribing to the channel. The idea here is to continue exploring these inner workings of the human mind calmly, in depth, and without easy simplifications. Always with better questions than quick answers. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple like, "This message was for me. I read," and that helps transform this space into a real conversation, not just a video disappearing on the timeline. And if you felt that connection during the video, that moment of pause to think, leave a like too. It's a silent way of saying that this type of content makes sense and deserves to continue reaching more curious people like you. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click there and continue reading.